Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Leverton Review, where my mission is to become the most prolific reviewer of all time by reviewing literally everything. Maybe not literally, but today I am reviewing the 1967 crime classic called In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. It's kind of an infamous book, it's a legendary book. And the book came out in 1967, and the reason why it's so legendary and infamous is it's one of the first really, really popular true crime books. And Capote claimed for the rest of his life that he was the one who actually invented the true crime genre. That's not actually true, but he is certainly the one who popularized it. So, if you've ever listened to a true crime podcast or watched a true crime documentary or read a true crime book, you can probably thank Capote about that. And we could argue whether that's a net positive for society or a net negative for society. But right now, I'd like to focus on the actual book and the crime that Capote wrote about. So, in 1959, in November of 1959, November 15th to be exact, four members of the Clutter family were murdered in their farmhouse. So there was Herbert William Herb Clutter, and he was sort of this really respected and wealthy farmer in the area. And he had hired somebody as a hired hand, and that person had gone to prison later, and he was telling his cellmates about how he had been working for this really rich guy, and the rich guy had a safe, and in the safe there was probably about $10,000. But the guy was exaggerating, and this exaggeration in this story will be important later. So, also in the farmhouse where it was his wife, Bonnie Mae Fox Clutter. She was a housewife, and I don't know why stories want to mention this, but apparently she suffered from clinical depression, and she was rarely seen around the community. Then there were their two children. They had more children. I think they had three other daughters, but those daughters had already grown up and left the house. Their youngest daughter, Nancy Mae Clutter, and I think she was 16 at the time of the murder, and she 15. I think she was 15. And she liked 4-H, which is this kind of like agricultural club in North America. She liked horseback riding. She was like really, really popular in the community because she would actually help younger people out with their schoolwork. If they didn't know how to do something, Nancy would help them out. Then the youngest child was their only boy named Kenyon. He was about 14 years old. He liked hunting. He liked working on trucks. But he had a truck that his dad bought him, even though he didn't have a license, and he was working on trying to get it to work so he could drive it when he got a license. So those four were brutally murdered by two criminals, one named Richard Dick Hitchcock and the other named Perry Edward Smith. And the reason they were murdered, as I said, is because Hitchcock was in a cell with the guy who had worked for Clutter, and that guy was telling a lot of stories, and Hitchcock came up with this plan that he was going to go to this farmhouse with his prison buddy named Percy Smith, and they were going to rob the Clutters. They were going to take the money from the safe. And it's not made clear in the book, I think, but they planned to kill everybody there, actually. That was the plan, to leave no witnesses. But I think two-thirds of the book are kind of interviews of Smith and Hitchcock. So it's kind of hard to tell what is actually reality because Smith was trying to portray himself in the most positive light. So he said that he wanted to stop at some place and get some disguises so the family wouldn't recognize them, so they wouldn't have to be murdered. But then later he said that he murdered all of them. And before that, he said that he murdered everybody except the women, and Hitchcock murdered the women. So uh, who knows exactly? So if we talk about Smith and Hitchcock, they both had very difficult lives. Smith more than Hitchcock because Smith's um, Smith's early life was that his mom was an alcoholic and his dad was abusive and he was malnutrition. He had suffered from malnutrition and he was sent to an orphanage. And the nuns in the orphanage would beat him because he was wetting his bed and due to the malnutrition. And he was sent to a Salvation Army orphanage, which I didn't know that they had those kind of orphanages. But anyway, he was sent there, and he claims that someone tried to drown him, one of the workers, and then he went back to live with his dad, who, as I previously mentioned, he was abusive. And Hitchcock had a more conventionally successful life. He said that he had parents who provided for his needs, but he also said that they weren't what you call a loving home, whatever that meant. And the interesting fact that ties these two killers together is that they both had really horrible traffic accidents. Smith had one that caused him to be disfigured, his legs to be disfigured, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. And Hitchcock had an accident, I think it was a car accident, and his family claimed that that accident actually caused a big change in his personality. And the prosecution kind of dismissed that, but I think nowadays, with what we know about brain injuries and traumatic brain injuries, I think it's completely possible because he went from, you know, kind of having his life go in the right direction to having his life kind of fall apart, and he started to pass bad checks and get in a lot of debt, and then he went to prison, and the rest unfortunately is history. um so as I said, there's conflicting accounts of the actual murders. um Smith said that they didn't plan on killing everyone originally, or he didn't at least, but Hitchcock did. And then later he said that they did plan on killing everyone. Hitchcock wrote a manuscript that wasn't published, which is kind of interesting actually. It wasn't published because he sent it to someone, a reporter, and the reporter sent it to Random House to be potentially published. And Random House said that Capote was working on this book and they weren't interested, which was probably a bit of a bad move from a marketing perspective, even though In Cold Blood was like a super successful book. This book, from the perspective of the killers, might have been also very successful. But in that book that Hitchcock wrote, he said that his regret is that Smith killed all of the people and he wanted to kill uh, some of them. And he also mentioned that this was the result of a killing for hire, that Smith and Hitchcock had been paid $5,000 to kill Herb Clutter. But then there's some holes in that story because um, yeah, the first hole in the story is that um, is that the sorry, I lost my train of thought there. The first hole in this story is that where did the money go if they'd been paid $5,000 to kill that guy? Then they didn't have any money 6 weeks later, and Hitchcock said that they had spent the money. They've been paid before, and they spent the money. But who knows? Another kind of thing that needs to be mentioned is that in the book, Capote heavily indicates or insinuates that Hitchcock was a pedophile and that Smith sort of protected one of the children, the girl Nancy, from being raped by Hitchcock. But I don't think that it makes much sense because Percy said that, and Percy was also a really self-interested guy, and I don't think it makes much difference if you murder four people if you prevented one of them from being raped before they died. You know, it kind of sounds like he wanted to make this like an act of mercy, but not really. So let's talk about the flaws of the book because those are the kind of things that happened, and eventually Hitchcock and Smith would be hung in Kansas City, and Hitchcock basically he didn't say anything. Like you could make like a public statement. He didn't say anything, but he talked to the people from the Kansas Bureau of Investigations, and he said that there was no hard feelings, and he actually donated his eyes. So after he died, two of his corneas were used in other patients. And it's kind of weird, and this might sound bad because I I think that I have complicated feelings about capital punishment because I think actually keeping somebody in prison for all of their life is much of a crueler punishment than capital punishment is because you know you die once, you don't die like multiple times. But anyway, if the state does decide that they should kill people who commit these brutal murders, I think they don't need permission to use their body parts for anything that they can be used for. That's my opinion. But anyway, so he donated his eyes, and then theoretically he helped two people. But yeah, he got hung, and then Smith, he said that capital punishment was both ethically and morally wrong, and then he was killed. But let's talk about the book, the actual book, In Cold Blood. I think on the one hand, it does a good job of establishing the kind of world that the Clutters lived in. He talked to their friends, he talked to their neighbors. But the problem with it is that it's only 25% of the book. And then he spends the 75% of the book talking about and talking with the actual killers. And he's clearly sympathetic to one of the killers more than the other. So he tends to believe what Percy says, and he tends to kind of denigrate what Hitchcock says. And I think that it's a mistake because Percy even and I don't know, I wasn't there, and I wouldn't want to have been there, but from my perspective I think they both probably killed those people, and they both deserved the punishment for that. And one kind of thread through the book is that Percy might have been in love with Hitchcock. So Smith might have been in love with Hitchcock, and that's why he took the fall for the four murders. I mean, it didn't really matter because they both were executed for it. And I think in that situation, it kind of makes sense. You know, two people were there, and you know, four people died, and you know that one of them could have stopped the other one at any moment, and they didn't. So even if Hitchcock had not literally pulled the trigger or not literally stabbed somebody, he is as guilty as Smith was. So I don't, it's clearly like biased. And I think that with true crime you can have a point of view, but I think if you're going to be biased, then you need to be more biased in favor of the victims and not really biased in favor of the criminals. Because Capote wait, and he's not even really that in favor of the criminals because he waited until they were executed before publishing his book. So he was working for the on the book for like 6 years or something. So I don't think that shows that he is like this kind of really really moral guy and he really really cares about his friend Percy. Well, I think that's the mistake is that they became friends. And I forgot which book. I think it was Talking with Serial Killers or Sleeping with Murderers, I think is the title. And that guy mentions the fact like he has interviewed these murderers and stuff and he's mentioned the fact that they tend to try to get involved in the lives of the people who are reporting their crimes because it's interesting, right? For them, if they're sitting in prison and they don't have anything to do, and this really articulate person starts to be super interested in their lives, then of course you're gonna be kind of fascinated by that, and you're gonna want to keep that going. But in that book, he makes it clear what the lines are. Like, I'm not your friend. So in that book, he gets given a car, and the car is being used for some like. So the murderer gives him a car, and the idea is that he will sell the car and then give him the money. And he doesn't end up selling the car; he just gives it away, and he doesn't actually financially profit from the car. So he's putting down clear lines, and I think Capote didn't really do that. The other thing that I don't like about this book, and it's really connected to the time that it was written in, is that it's heavily connected to the like this psychological theory of the time, and it makes it feel quite dated because there's a bit in the book where they in Kansas at the time, and I don't know now, but in Kansas they had this rule that you couldn't use the insanity defense if you knew what you were doing was right or wrong at the time. And I think actually that's a pretty reasonable standard of the insanity defense. And I think the problem is there's a difference between legal insanity and clinical insanity. So you can be somebody who's clinically depressed, but you still know right from wrong. And just because you're clinically depressed doesn't mean that you you can't be held legally culpable for your crimes. So Capote is trying to argue that Smith and Hitchcock are are legally insane because they did this insane thing, and then somebody else gets on death row and he tries to argue the same thing. But I I think that there are people who do acts where it's kind of unclear their kind of moral culpability. There was a case in Canada recently where somebody said that he was doing LSD and he thought his parents were demons, so he murdered them. So who knows if that story is actually true, but if it is true, I don't think that you can be held to the same standard of guilt as somebody who understands what they're doing. So I don't think that a person who is temporarily insane goes like because they had to drive like 500 miles in the middle of the night. They had to find the farmhouse. They'd never been there before. They had to tie some people up and murder them. They were looking for this money. They didn't get it. So I don't think that it was insanity. I think that they got angry because they couldn't find the money, and they ended up, and this is the most ridiculous part of this case, they ended up with $40 and a radio, which, you know, in 1959 is a lot more money now, but what is it, like $300 to kill four people for? Kind of very, very ridiculous. And yeah, so I think the book ultimately fails because it doesn't show you, it's not balanced. And I think that Capote probably wanted to write an anti-capital punishment book. And I think that there are better ways to do that, right? Than try to befriend a person who murdered four people in cold blood. And that's your title, In Cold Blood. So it's not ironic in this case. They did murder those people in cold blood. All right, but what do you think? I know, difficult topic, but have you read the book? I know that there's some movies based on the book. Let me know what you think in the comment section. So thank you for watching my video. If you liked it, please like the video. Please subscribe to my channel. I'm trying to get to 10, count them 10 reviewers by the end, 10 subscribers by the end of June. So I think we can do that. We're at 4 right now, and I will just keep racking up the goals. It's fun. It's a side quest. It's a quest for the channel, not a side quest. It's a quest. All right, thank you. Bye-bye.